it's an interesting trap for young players, of course, because, employees need to be aware of what's happening because it can be an unpleasant surprise.
This week's Toil and Trouble looks at the KiwiSaver superannuation scheme and what employers need to do. And joining me now to discuss this is employment lawyer Shelley Eden. Hi Shelley.
Hi.
So talk us through the different contributions under the KiwiSaver scheme.
So there's basically two contributions. There's the employee contribution and the employer contribution. Both compulsory if someone is part of the scheme, but the employer contribution is a 3% amount. The employee gets to choose what they contribute. So it could be 3, 4, 6, 8 or 10%. And employees can change that during the course of their employment. They can choose the amount. So
I guess if they want to feel generous, they could pay more than 3% if they wanted to.
Employers absolutely could, yes, and some employees do get that agreement. I see that a little bit with Trans-Tasman clients because in Australia the percentages are higher, so sometimes that's applied to New Zealand employees as well.
Are they compulsory, the contributions from employers? Do they have to pay it?
They do have to pay it, but there's a little wriggle there, a little thing of interest there. So what the law says, what the KiwiSaver Act says, is that the employer contribution is on top of the employee's wages or salary, unless by agreement. So they can agree something else. So in negotiations for the commencement of employment, the employer might say, well, no, what we do here is we have KiwiSaver included in your wages. We deduct it from that, so if you earn $60,000, it's going to be out of that money and you'll get less in your hand. And we put that into KiwiSaver. So it's open for the parties to agree to that, yes.
So then in that case, the employee would be paying both for their own contribution and for the employer's theoretically sort of out of that amount of money.
Look, it's definitely that's a way of looking at it. I think the employer way of looking at it is that it's a sort of like a total remuneration approach. So your package is $60,000 and that includes our contribution to your KiwiSaver. Or it could be your package is 60 and we pay on top of it. One of the reasons an employer would want it to be inclusive is not just being mean and penny pinching, but to get kind of consistency across employees. So you get 60,000, I get 60,000, whether some of that goes into our KiwiSaver or it all goes into our hands is up to us. But our employer knows that their costs are set and that it's going to be the 60,000. Whereas if both you and I aren't in KiwiSaver, we've both opted out and then we're both on 60,000, you change your mind, you now opt in, well, you're now going to get 60 plus the 3%. And so then I'm going to say to my employer, cool, I want that too, please. I would like the 3%. And so it just can lead to these little inequities potentially. But it's an interesting trap for young players, of course, because, employees need to be aware of what's happening because it can be an unpleasant surprise.
And it does have to be negotiated, not just forced on people.
That's exactly right. So it should be written into the employment agreement if it's going to be that. And then there's a process by which employees are given their employment agreement, get time to read it, review it, and can ask questions. So it's totally open for an employee to say, well, look, no, you told me my salary was 60,000 when we had the interview, and I would quite like KiwiSaver on top of that, please. And that's absolutely open. And of course, if it's not negotiated ahead of time, it has to be on top.
What about those on a minimum wage?
So there is definitely a different position with them because what the law says very clearly is that you're entitled to receive the entirety of the minimum wage. So taking KiwiSaver out of that is a breach, basically, and there's case law on that to support that. So for employees on or close to minimum wage, you can't have that policy of inclusive. You've got to actually make sure that the minimum wage and KiwiSaver are on top.
And what about casual staff? Because a lot of people do employ casual staff now.
So casual staff still join KiwiSaver compulsory. We all have to join it when we first start employment. We can opt out. It's no different for casual staff.
Okay. So some employees may be in KiwiSaver and in another fund as well, or an existing scheme before KiwiSaver came in. What's the situation when that happens?
So there's a process under the legislation. If a scheme is what is called a qualifying scheme and it meets this criteria of sort of being an old scheme, it can the money in that can transfer into a KiwiSaver account. I think most of those schemes have been sort of reworked into KiwiSavers or they kind of sit outside it, but it doesn't change the fact. So even if you might have an old super scheme sitting there, maybe if it's not a qualifying scheme and you can't transfer the money across, you will still get enrolled into the KiwiSaver. But if your scheme was a really good one, you'd probably opt out at that point, right? And then, whether or not your employer had to pay into that old scheme would depend on whether it met the criteria in the legislation. That's something to talk to your employer about. Yeah.
And do employers need to think about the tax they pay on contributions as well?
The employers need to confirm in the agreement that they're going to pay the taxation side of it. So yes, they do need to think about that.
And what happens when, I need to buy my first house? I mean, I'm a bit past that myself now, but, if you're young and you want to buy your first house and you take a savings suspension, where does that leave the employer?
So there's two ways of doing that with the new house situation. So one is, as you say, a suspension. So once you've been 1 year in KiwiSaver, you can take between 3 months and 1 year break where you don't contribute, but then the employer doesn't either in that time. They could. So you could have an agreement with your employer that they'll continue to make their contributions while you have a holiday from a suspension from your own. The other thing is that, of course, you can withdraw KiwiSaver after 3 years in certain circumstances, including buying a first home, and there's some rules and criteria around that. But yes, it's quite important to know that if you are getting a suspension from putting into your KiwiSaver, and you can do that as many times as you like, you can have them back to back, it actually is quite flexible, but nor does your employer have to. That's worth considering. And if you want to get the government contribution, you would have to contribute the minimum amount in order to get the government contribution. So that's quite important to think about and perhaps try not to miss out on if people can afford to make enough to get that government contribution, because obviously that's just sort of money from the government towards your superannuation. It's very valuable, worth having.
Absolutely. And in your experience, Shelley, do most employers pay this on top of the existing sort of thing, or is it often negotiated?
It's a real mixed bag. I do see it both ways. I think possibly in the higher salary levels, often because we're taking this total remuneration approach. And so what you'll see is employers, they have the cost of the salary and then any bonus and maybe a vehicle and KiwiSaver, and that's that's your total package, and it's $120,000.
And hopefully, personal health insurance in the
mix.
mean,
there'd be a lot of things we'd love to have as part of that package. Absolutely. Personal health insurance, all the, memberships to clubs and gyms and all sorts of wonderful things, which all employees should probably get, but or would love to have. So you tend to see it as it's kind of included in that number. So if the number's 150, then all these things are included in that number. And obviously with the lower paid workers, it's definitely on top. And then everything else, it's a kind of mixed bag. So when I draft employment agreements for clients, it goes both ways. And I'll ask that question, and that's one of the things. Do you want to do it this way? Do you want to do it that way? Have a little talk about it. And then it's in the contract that gets offered to the employees. And then it's open for, hopefully a good faith negotiation process for employees to be able to have input into that as well.